Moving right along, I'd now like to welcome Sophie Ismail to the podium. Sophie is the federal Labor candidate for the seat of Melbourne, and it's my great delight to welcome her here tonight to speak in response to these issues and to outline hopefully her and her party's plans for the future. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tom. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Barbara, for the invitation. I've been asked by Richard Wynne, the Minister for Planning, to convey his apologies this evening. He had another engagement. I'm not representing Richard, but I'm very happy to take back any issues that come up this evening and raise them with him. As a federal candidate, obviously I'm bringing a federal perspective to this issue, and as a candidate I'm here in large part to listen to you, and I commend you on the establishment of this body. Labor understands that urban policy matters and that every level of government, local, state and federal, has to be involved, and that the community has to be involved in these consultations. So this group is a vital step forward for having the voice of owners heard in this debate about urban policy. I'm not an owner, I'm a renter. I have lived in a high density unit just outside the electorate, actually in South Melbourne, and I have very much had my quiet enjoyment of that premises interrupted by short stay guests, so I sympathise. And as speakers before have said, this is a very complex issue, and it's up to policymakers to strike the right balance, and the question is, where is that balance? Earlier today I was at Uber, and we were having a conversation with the Shadow Assistant Treasurer, Andrew Lee, about the sharing economy, and the reality is the peer-to-peer economy is causing disruption and causing headaches for regulators around the world, and it will continue to do so, and it really is incumbent on policymakers to catch up and consult and get this right, and get it right sooner rather than later. As we all know, or perhaps we should all know, Australia is one of the most urbanised countries in the world, and Melbourne is currently the second largest city in Australia. It will soon be the largest. We will have a population of 8 million by 2050. This is in the context of huge economic shifts. The peer-to-peer economy, we've got housing affordability, we've got climate change, we've got inadequate infrastructure, inadequate investment in public transport, community safety, social cohesion. We're facing many, many challenges as a city, and really Labor understands that urban policy is something that needs to be right at the top of the federal agenda. And Anthony Albanese is our Shadow Minister for Cities, and he's made a number of comments about the importance of urban policy. And Labor has a plan for our cities to make them more productive, more sustainable and more livable. It's called Our Cities, Our Future, and I encourage you to have a read. One of the key problems that we're facing is a disconnect between jobs growth and housing. So jobs are growing where housing is not, and that's creating a drive-in, drive-out situation. We need more houses in the city, and because that's where the jobs are. But as people have said, density done poorly reduces amenity, and it causes environmental problems. And we have to factor in green space, we have to factor in imagination, we have to factor in livability and community. And again, this is why this organisation is so important. So we now at the federal level for the first time have a new Minister for Cities. Malcolm Turnbull has appointed a Minister for Cities. It's yet to become clear what he will do, but it is fantastic that we have one. Labor's taken this issue very, very seriously. We established a major cities unit that was disbanded under Tony Abbott. We've created Infrastructure Australia and massively funded it to invest in infrastructure. When we left government in 2007, when we entered government, we were 20th in the OECD on infrastructure spending. When we left, we were number 1. So this is an issue that we take extremely seriously. We've invested in public transport in Victoria, the regional rail and the metro rail system. We established the Urban Policy Forum to consult with the community about urban policy. We've consulted with state governments through COAG. We've established the Australian Council of Local Governments to engage with local governments on this issue. We've also established the Livable Cities program to provide support for projects enhancing community. I think one of the problems I expect to be raised is that urban policy is often captive to property, infrastructure and financial interests that put private gains over the public interest and over the community interest, and that has to stop. Albanese's talked about a 30-minute city where everything that we need to thrive in our lives, our work, our study, our educational opportunities, our leisure, is within 30 minutes walking, driving or public transport, not driving, walking or public transport distance. And that is a nice dream. Cities matter very much. Melbourne has generated about 2 million jobs and it will create millions more into the future. With the rise of the Asian middle class, cities are going to be the hubs of the new productivity, the drivers of the new economy, and they've got to be productive. And that's why it's so important that regulation doesn't stifle productivity, but also that it maintains community. And that's the discussion that's happening in the Uber space now about how we make sure that regulation fosters innovation, but protects workers and protects community standards and protects our community. There are similar discussions going on at the state level, and I know that the Andrews government is committed to reducing unruly behaviour in short stay buildings. Your advice, Barbara, is that has largely been addressed, certainly in the Watergate building, which is fantastic. It's still an issue elsewhere, and the Independent Panel on Short Stays has released its report, which is being considered by the government at the moment, and there will be further consultations, which no doubt you'll be part of. But I was struck when I read the report how difficult this is. There were, I think, 7 panel members. Many reached different conclusions. There were lots of different arguments. There are many different models around the world and even just around the country. So really, I think the national perspective is very important. We've got to get planning right, and we've got to get this right at the national level. Labor's policy on the sharing economy is that there's got to be that balance, that we have to accept, I think, on some level, that the sharing economy or the peer-to-peer economy is here. It's here and it's here to stay, and it's up to regulators to get it right and to make sure that our quality of life and our communities are not undermined. So I look forward to a discussion this evening, and I'm happy to answer any questions and take away any queries that you have to raise with Richard Wynne. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Sophie. And just to keep the flow going, I'd now like to welcome our very next speaker up to the platform, Councillor Rohan Leppert, who's the Chair of the Arts and Culture Portfolio, and relevantly the Deputy Chair of the Planning Portfolio for the City of Melbourne, and a member of the Australian Greens Party. Thank you very much for welcoming Mr. Leppert.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thank you very much for inviting me. Can I preface my comments by saying that what I'm about to say is not City of Melbourne policy. I'm very much here speaking as an individual council, not on behalf of the council as a whole. Can I also acknowledge country? This is Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung clan, land of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. I think it's fantastic to have a group like We Live Here. It's been a long time coming, I think. Now that it is here, a few of us councillors have been reflecting and thinking, goodness, we probably should have had such a group a very, very long time ago, but I think it's absolutely fantastic that finally we do have a group like We Live Here, so congratulations right from the outset. I'll come back to that right at the end. Of course, as we've heard from other speakers, and as you all know, Melbourne's facing a bit of an apartment boom at the moment. More so really than any other city, in fact, in Australia. The number of apartment approvals, particularly in the very, very middle of Melbourne, South Bank, CBD, Docklands in particular, is unprecedented compared to anything we've seen in the history of this country, and it's also at a faster rate than we're seeing in other cities. And we need to stop and think why that is. I'm not saying it's a good thing, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but we always need to analyse why that is. Melbourne is by far the lowest taxing regime when it comes to the planning and building approvals process of any city. That's fantastic for investment. The previous planning minister, Matthew Guy, every time he approved a new tower in the middle of the city, he put out a press release saying, this tower is responsible for X thousand jobs. It's usually multiplied by a factor of 3 or 4 more than I actually wish it was going to be, worth X million to the economy, again, probably exaggerated slightly. You can tell my political biases already. And the whole motivation behind approving all of these apartments was the economy and jobs. Fantastic. The Victorian economy really is a beneficiary of the apartment boom that we're seeing in the middle of the city. If we didn't have that apartment boom, the Victorian economy would not be in the state that it's in today. 2 years ago, though, the city of Melbourne itself, of course, just a very, very small centre of Greater Melbourne, where there are 31, 32 councils, just the city of Melbourne was the fastest growing local government area in Australia. Now, the council itself assesses a huge number of applications every week. We often do that to provide advice to the minister, so the minister can make a final decision. If it's above 25,000 square metres, of course, the minister's the final decision maker. But we often make our own decisions on a whole lot of smaller apartments as well. And the number of apartments that are approved in any given month is actually quite mind-boggling, at least to me. I confess I don't live in an apartment, I live in a house in Kensington. But the City of Melbourne can only assess those applications under the rules that we've got. And I'm sure many people are here today because they understand that the rules that we've got are flawed. I'm going to talk a little bit about the planning process. Of course, we're talking a lot today as well about the Owners Corporation Act and the flaws in that process as well, and I'll get back to that as well. But my basic pitch here is that, of course, policy is not keeping up with the reality of the economic boom driven by apartments in Australian capital cities, but particularly in Melbourne. Our development contribution scheme is decades old. Compared to Sydney and Brisbane, developers don't need to pay taxes on the apartments that they're seeking to build and seek a planning approval for, and that means that we're creating an enormous funding gap between what we know we're going to need for future populations in terms of infrastructure, libraries, childcare, you name it, and what councils, it's not going to be state governments except for the very large transport infrastructure projects, what councils are going to be able to pay for. That gap is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and because we can only deal with the rules that we've got that the state government has set, that's not going to be curbed anytime soon. The apartment guidelines as well, lagging way behind Sydney and Brisbane. Hopefully the apartment guidelines process that the Minister has kick-started again once he was elected. He took the process that Matthew Guy started and has added a step to the process, but that really needs to happen as fast as possible. Third-party rights is another example where we're now lagging way behind where we need to be. Many will know that in the Docklands, for example, or in the capital city zone, we don't have the right to be told about applications that are going up next door anymore. The reason for that is that those third-party notice rights were written and designed in a time where the writers weren't really thinking about the middle of the city and high-density apartments. And of course, if we were to have notice and review rights in the city, then the number of apartments that would need to be written to could often number in the thousands for any given application. And the argument goes that that's unwieldy. I've tried many times to reinstate third-party rights because I think that until we've got a better system, everyone deserves the right to know what's going up next door and to express an opinion on it, even if that opinion is ultimately not held up by the responsible authority or VCAT. It is a basic democratic right that you should have a say on what that is. And of course, in the Docklands and the CBD, unless the application goes up inside a heritage overlay, you have absolutely no right to even know what's going on next door, and you have to stumble across the information as best you can. The building laws are another good example. Of course, the La Crosse building, everyone's aware of what's been in the news recently. It is an absolute lunacy that the municipal building surveyor needs to write to every single individual property owner and seek orders for the fixing of the cladding on that building, and each individual property owner must then collectively decide how that's going to be fixed. It's not going to work, of course it's not going to work, but that's the legislative framework we've got. And again, the legislative framework was not designed with apartments of that size in mind. Finally, I would argue that VCAT forces responsible authorities, whether it's council or whether it's the minister, to often make bad decisions. Planners often argue for performance-based policies against which they can assess planning applications. The problem with that is that unless you also reform the tribunal processes, then the members on VCAT, as we see far too often, will always revert back to the easiest numerical standard they can find, and too often that's a lowest common denominator issue. Once upon a time, the council advocated for a 24-metre tower separation inside the CBD docklands everywhere, and now the new rules, because they were simply not working, VCAT was frequently approving tower separations of under 10 metres. The new mandatory rules are 10 metres. It's just not good enough. That's not the sort of amenity that we know that we need. But the future is going to be in apartments. Sophie said that we're looking at a city of 8 million. That's certainly what the state government's current projections are looking at. And if we're going to be a sustainable city where the urban growth boundary does not just continue and continue and continue to expand, then we have to look at well-designed, sustainable apartments, and that's where the future lies. And so there's this whole raft of legislative reforms that are desperately needed. I wish that the council had the ability to change that, like other councils which take up entire metropolitan areas in other cities might be able to do. But of course, all of those problems lie at the moment with the state government. And as I said, council is too often picking up the pieces. The amount of infrastructure that we're putting into Docklands at the moment is fantastic. I'm sure many of you will have seen the new boating hub that's just gone in, the maternal child health centre and the library and all the rest of that, but we're not going to be able to continue to pay for that unless we reform some of these rules and bring Melbourne up to the standards, even of Sydney and Brisbane, which themselves are lacking, I think, well behind where they need to be. I'll just have one little side issue. I think that many of our problems could be solved with a little bit of rethink about metropolitan governance. I note that Australia, compared to other OECD nations, has not reverted to a system where councils across metropolitan areas band together in coalitions and try to tackle some of these problems themselves, like you see in Vancouver, like you see in Barcelona, like you see in London. All that's a bit different. That's got a strong mayor executive system where, of course, everyone knows Boris Johnson has a lot of clout to really set the policy directions of the city. We're not having any of those conversations in Melbourne or in Australia. And if we're really looking at a city of 8 million people, it's not just our laws that need to be updated, but it's our entire governance systems as well. I've just rattled off about 8 to 10 enormous problems that I don't have solutions for in the next 5 or 6 seconds. The point there I think we need to really make is that none of these problems are going to be solved unless councils and state government and very, very importantly the community are willing to sit down and coordinate on these issues. There are 88 seats in the Victorian Legislative Assembly. 2 or maybe really 3 concerned have this real problem where our policies around high-rise apartments are well out of date. 3 out of 88 isn't really enough to get this stuff. It's a guarantee that this stuff is on the legislative agenda no matter which parliament term you're in. And so we need to look at alternatives to make sure that these issues are on the agenda. The Minister's Department has a million things to do. Their staff are overstretched like any department staff are. And apartment guidelines is just going to be one in a sea of many, many things that we hope will be boosted up to the top 3 priorities, but is going to languish until the Minister's staff can get around to it. That's a problem, we need to fix it. So, I think that it's fantastic that there's finally groups to agitate for change. I'm committed, just as I'm sure all previous speakers have said, to do anything I can to work with groups like this and individuals who are here, or anyone that you'd like to put me in touch with. All of my contact details, of course, are online. But collectively, agitating for change is how stuff is going to get done. I think recently we've seen other important changes in Docklands, CBD, South Bank, including, of course, 3 new local papers for recent years, and I think already we're seeing a community building around those communities of interest that wasn't possible before you've got that media voice to speak on behalf of all residents and owners. But so too have we been missing this other space here with a group like We Live Here. So I think it's absolutely fantastic that there are so many people here to be part of this group, which is so very needed, and anything I can do to assist in that council role where we cannot make legislative changes, but boy can we lobby for changes, and we can advocate for X, Y and Z as the Secretary does. He's Melbourne's chief spruiker. Just like me, he can't change acts of parliament, but we certainly can do what we can to speak on behalf of residents and do what we can to get those changes that I've outlined today and so many others. Thank you.